So in this art lesson today, we're going to be learning to paint using an airbrush to create relatively realistic looking lips. This tutorial is for the absolute beginner, someone who's looking to learn the basics of airbrushing, such as using an eraser to pull out highlights, using a shield or masks to define shapes, and also the basics in mixing colors. So let's start by mixing a simple flesh tone that's very warm for the pink in the lips. First color I'm using is called Scarlet Red by Createx Illustration Colors. I want to desaturate the hue of the red, so I'm going to use a little bit of this moss green, about 1 or 2 drops to around 20 drops of red. I generally like my paint a little bit thinner, so I add in a few drops of distilled water. Once that's done, I just mix this up and I'll get my basic transparent tone. Now, what I want to do is I want to add some white to it, and that's going to do 2 things. 1, it's going to lighten the color, and 2, it's going to add some opacity to it. So when you spray it, it's not going to be fully transparent. This way it'll help me make sure that I don't go too dark with this color. This color here is close enough to what I want. Now you could even just use pure red for it. The reason I added a tiny bit of green is that green is the complement to red. So what it's going to do is it's going to knock down the saturation a little bit, so it's not too red. It's just a little bit more muted, which helps create a more realistic looking picture. In my opinion, the foundation to any painting is drawing. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start by drawing the contours. The contours just mean the outline of the image itself, so no shading at all. I'm going to be drawing these lips freehand here because these are not specific to an individual person like they would be on a portrait. Generally, if you get these close, they'll look good enough for a painting. You don't have to be too precise or perfect with this. As long as you get the lips generally symmetrical, the painting will come out looking just fine. On the upper lip, you want to get this bow shape. So what I did in the beginning was I drew a line right down the middle using a ruler, and that gave me my point of symmetry. So I basically drew the exact same thing on the left and on the right. If you're new to drawing, don't worry about trying to get this perfect or looking just like mine. As long as you get it relatively close to what I have here, the painting's going to look fine. Now, for the teeth here, what I'm doing is I drew a horizontal line using a ruler, and I'm going to use this to space out the teeth. On this one, I'm adding about 4 teeth to it. Now, teeth are not hard to draw, but the key is you want to keep them subtle when we get into painting. You don't want to have dark lines in between them. If you leave blank spaces between it, generally what happens is when we look at it, our eyes kind of fill in the gap. So on teeth, less is more, and you'll see what I mean by that when we get further into the painting. So this is about good enough for the teeth. You can see I have about 6 in here, and the reason is that the upper lip is covering them. So if you're having trouble with drawing the teeth, you could completely skip them and draw the lower lip closer to the upper lip, and that way it's going to look like the mouth is closed and you're not going to have to worry about teeth at all. You could just skip that whole part. With drawing the lower lip, we want to do the same thing as we did with the upper. The key is having this symmetrical. So I'm using that line right down the middle, that symmetrical line, to use as my reference to draw the shapes from the left to the right, right down to the middle. You're going to see here that I start on one side, the left, draw it to the middle, and then I go to the right side and I do the exact same thing. The only thing you want to do here is focus on getting it symmetrical. You don't really have to worry about anything else. As you can see, the drawing is very simple, but that's all we're going to need for this one. So now we're going to start by adding some paint, and we're going to start with the lower lip first. Since an airbrush sprays paint, the line is going to be very soft, so we're going to need some tools to help sharpen and define our lines. The tool I'm using here is called an airbrush shield, and the point of it is to block off areas where I don't want paint. So I'll lay it down on the contours, on the edges, and spray a bit, and the paint is only going to go where I want it to. You could buy one of these, or you could even make one just out of paper or cardboard that you cut into a curve or a straight line. The color I'm using here is the color that we mixed in the beginning of the video, and I'm making sure that I don't spray too much. I'm just spraying a very light dusting of paint to keep it light. If I want to go darker, I can later by spraying more layers of paint. So once I have the paint down, just that thin layer, I can come in and start adding some texture to it. So what I do is I use an eraser or an X-Acto razor blade, and this is going to help me pull out some highlights. If you're going to try this one yourself, I recommend pausing the video in the beginning that showed the completed painting so you have a reference of where the highlights are. But as you can see here, I'm just using different tools and just basically scratching or removing the paint. This is going to give me a brighter area, and that brighter area is going to look a little bit closer to us in the darker areas, and that's going to help give us a rounded 3D shape. You don't have to worry about removing too much paint because you could always spray over the area again with the paint we mixed in the beginning to darken it a little bit more. Down in the video description, I'll make sure I leave links to the tools I use. These are basic erasers and just a normal X-Acto knife. The only difference is this eraser is a pen one, so it's a little bit more aggressive than a normal pencil eraser. So I'm going to continue along the lower lip here, adding texture where I see it from my reference. Now it's important to note here that the light is shining directly on the subject. So what that means is the lower lip is going to be brightest right in the center, and the sides and the top and bottom are going to be a little bit darker. So the paint we mixed in the beginning is still relatively a transparent color. So what that means is when we want it darker, we're going to have to spray a little more. So you could see in this top left corner where it's a darker red, all I did was spray a little bit more paint. Same with the top and bottom. If I want an area a little bit lighter, I could also use my eraser to pull some of that paint out. In order to erase the paint, I definitely recommend buying createx illustration color because it's just very easy to remove and it has a delayed drying time. Another option too is ComArt paint, which is pretty inexpensive and it works just as well. There are a lot of different types of papers and surfaces you can buy that allow you to remove paint very easily. Some of them can get pretty expensive, but what I found is the absolute easiest is to just grab some gesso and then apply it to either a blank piece of paper or to a canvas and get it very smooth, let it dry, and it works just fine. You just use a little sandpaper at the end. I have a video explaining how to do this. It's so easy to do, so I definitely recommend checking that out. I'll have a link for it in the description below. Going back to the painting here, another tool you could use to get very sharp lines is some vinyl tape. This one here is made by 3M and they come in a variety of sizes. One of the most important things in airbrushing is to make sure you use a light hand and you don't spray too much paint. If you want to go darker, you have to build your values up slowly. If you spray too much paint, especially with the shield or masking tape, what's going to happen is the paint's going to run underneath it and you're going to get these ugly lines and it's difficult to clean up. So just spray light, build your tones up slowly, and have patience with it. For the color underneath the teeth, I used sepia, which is made by Createx, and I just added a drop or two of distilled water to thin it out, but I also made sure I used shields to get my lines very sharp. I'm using a shield with a tiny bit of sepia to spray a very light dusting of paint in between each tooth. It's very important to keep this subtle. If the lines are too dark between the teeth, they're going to look rotten. It's going to look like an infection and ugly, so try to keep it as subtle as possible. As soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to use my X-Acto blade and my eraser to pull out a few of these sharp, specular highlights on each tooth and underneath the teeth here where the tongue is. You have to ensure that you're using a smooth canvas to pull out the highlights, because if you're using one just bought from the store, the canvas is going to have too much texture and you're not going to be able to remove the paint. So if you watch that video, it'll explain how to set this up. The sepia color on the teeth is a little bit too dark and a little too warm for my liking, so I'm going to use some pure white and spray a tiny bit over the top of it. That's going to do two things. One, it's going to lighten the teeth, it's going to bring the value up a little bit more, and secondly, when you spray an opaque color, a lighter opaque color over a darker color, it's going to always shift that color toward blue. So that blue cool shift is going to help negate some of the warm color of the sepia and give me a more natural color for the teeth. The next thing we want to do is add some of that color to the upper lip. Remember that the light source is shining directly on the subject, so the lower part of the lip, which is a little bit farther away, is going to be a bit darker. So I'm going to spray a little bit more at the bottom and ease up as I go further up the lip. This next part isn't needed, but what I did was I mixed a very basic flesh tone using about 10 drops burnt sienna and 1 or 2 drops of red violet, and then lightly sprayed this around the outside. This way it gives me something to erase into so I could add a few highlights above and below the lips. The last thing we need to do is use our eraser just to pull out some highlights on the top part of the upper lip. This way it's going to make that part look a little closer to us and the part next to the teeth move a little bit farther away. And right about here, I would call this done. As you can see, this is a very simple version of the lips. Maybe in the future, I'll do a more complicated, realistic one with more pores and more texture added to it. But this works just fine. If you're new to airbrushing and want to try this out, I recommend buying one of the cheapest airbrushes you can get. It really doesn't matter. In this video, I'm using an expensive Iwata Micron. It's absolutely not needed. Just get something cheap to start out with. What I do recommend is buying a good paint. The paint's going to make more of a difference in the airbrush you use, so try to pick up that Createx or the ComArt paint so you're able to erase it after you lay it down. So that's going to complete this one. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. I will get back to everyone. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.